Hello everybody, it's a little echoey and I know this is my weird spot. I've had a very busy week at work this week, but I did have a minute and I wanted to drop my thoughts on a new release that I got my hands on ARC for, and that is Djeli Clark's first go at a full-length novel, A Master of Djinn, which is coming out tomorrow, May 12th. And if you've watched my channel, you know that I'm a pretty big fan of the Djeli Clark that I've read. Up to this point, he has been a novella author that has focused a lot on sort of alternate fantasy histories. And by doing so, I think he's had some very interesting cultural critiques, or at least observations, both historically and for our current day, that I've really enjoyed. So I was really excited to get my hands on this book, again called A Master of Djinn. And just to say right away, I would definitely recommend you to pre-order this. It is a fantastically unique world, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, as with my other books that I've read by Djeli Clark. I found it incredibly fascinating, well written, even though I will say I could tell this was a first take at a novel where some of the strengths that I found in his novellas weren't quite there, especially with the pacing. So I'll talk about that more specifically. But first I want to talk about the book itself because it was so interesting. The book follows a young investigator by the name of Fatma, and she is the youngest investigator, and I think the first female, or at least one of the first female investigators in the Ministry of, well, what's the name of the office? Hold on, I'll look it up. Ministry of Alchemy, Enchantments, and Supernatural Entities in Cairo in 1912. And a lot of the specifics of the world work out through the book, so I don't want to say too much because one of my favorite parts of this book was to continually read about how the world had changed and was different from our world while only being slightly different, one very minor tweak. But it's in Cairo in 1912. And the basic idea of why this world is different is because something, I think the name for the historical event in this book is called the Boar or something like that, where this mysterious figure finds an alternate dimension where the Djinn live and somehow bring them to bear into our real world. And this mystic revolution has caused total change in how world history would have gone. Most primarily and importantly for this book is the magical entities, the Djinn themselves, as well as the existence of the old gods in Egypt and the prominence of Egypt on the world stage. Egypt is now the world power because the Djinn are particularly sort of geographically tied to that country and that region. But there are also, with the discovery of these mythical creatures, other countries are discovering their mythical roots as well. There's some references to like France trying to be more in touch with fairies, and Germany trying to be more in touch with like goblins and Norse mythology and things along those lines. So there's this idea that mythology that we in our world think is mostly fictitious, I won't speak for everyone, but think is fictitious, is real in this world, and it's come to bear on like the socio-economic and political atmosphere of the world, which is just cool. But this book actually follows a more boots on the ground story with Fatma, and it actually turns into basically like a crime thriller where we're trying to find out about this murder that takes place in the opening scene of this rich English lord in Egypt, and why he was murdered, and eventually this ties in with some of the more global politics I just talked about. I won't say more than that, except that you can tell I really felt immersed and loved the world. I mean, it was just so unique is the word I kept coming back to. If you are thinking that the fantasy genre is stale, or like that the urban fantasy thing is stale, like read Djeli Clark. Across his books, I find this to be the case. My favorite of his right now is Black God's Drums, but of what I've read, but I just really, really like his stuff overall. He has such a unique imagination. And while his prose really are more what I would call modern prose, in the sense that they are very simple, not too flowery, and he's very good about writing action, he also has, I think, a bite as far as his themes and how he focuses the repercussions of what happens to his main characters and to the world, particularly around things like race and social class, that I think is really, really important. And I think the reason I have a lot of trouble sometimes with modern fantasy is because the simplicity of the prose also reaches to the simplicity in the themes and the overall, like, what the work is saying. I don't think Djeli Clark falls into that. In fact, he uses his simple prose to make very profound points, and I really, really appreciate that. Really, my only negative with this book is that I do find the pacing to be a little slow, especially in the middle third of the book, which is pretty typical in novels. The middle third, they're setting up a lot of stuff. I just felt like there was a lot of sort of like fetch quests or side things, not side because they were important to the overall things, but like different things that needed to be done before we could actually get to the ending, because this needed to be a novel-length book, where the pacing was a strength in every other book I read by Clark. So I think this is the first go at of a full-length novel, and it showed some of the, not rust, I guess, but whatever the opposite of that, like growing into learning how to write fuller-length novels, because the pacing wasn't quite as good as it was in his previous books. Again, that there is strength there. So I would definitely recommend this book. If you've never read Djeli Clark, I would actually recommend reading Black God's Drums first. It's like 112 pages, and I think that will give you a better foundation for sort of his writing style in the world and get you really involved in his imagination, which I think will pay dividends. There is also a prequel to A Master of Djinn that I haven't read. I think it's called like it's called A Dead Djinn in Cairo, or like Tramcar 123. I can't remember. I'll probably put up a cover or something to make this better than what it is. But overall, I really liked it. My grade for this is a long endorsement, and it's really just because the slow pacing, but I would still really recommend it for most readers. So that's gonna be my grade for that. Thank you so much. I believe it's Tor? Ooh, I should know the top of my head, but I can't remember. Thank you for the publisher who sent me the ARC on this. Recommend, as always, that you pre-order this. Pre-ordering means a lot, and Djeli Clark is one of my favorite authors, so please support him. You guys are the best. As always, first in, last out.